Well, good morning and welcome to today's Drought Hour. My name is Connie Strunk and I'm a plant pathology field specialist, and I will be like the host and moderator today for our Drought Hour. And I will be also sharing the QR codes for those that need the CCA credits at the end of each presentation. They'll only be shown the one time, so you'll have to be ready to get those credits scanned in. But with that, I have the privilege of introducing our first presenter today. It'll be Laura Edwards, and she's going to talk about summer drought and climate update, kind of give us an outlook. She has a hard job of trying to keep us all happy. Anyhow, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Right, thanks, Connie. Certainly, since I last presented during the drought webinar about a month ago, situation has gotten worse in many areas, unfortunately. Have seen some small improvements in some areas, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But overall, drought is lingering in South Dakota and looks like it will hang on with us for a while longer. That's the short story. So to get into a little bit of the details, just looking at radar from last week, this was Thursday of last week, about the wettest part of the state, southern Black Hills, about the only area that got any really significant precipitation last week with some thunderstorm activity. But this is really unusual to see a radar image like that recently here in South Dakota. Talking about temperatures first, the first 2 weeks in June, exceptionally hot. Now, I want to say warm, hot. I know up here in Aberdeen, where I'm based out of, we had 4 days of 100+ degree temperatures. To put that into perspective, I believe since 2009, we've only had 9 days over 100 in Aberdeen. 4 of those in 1 month in 2017. So really it's unusual to get this hot, and we're seeing that really come out in spades here in June. So this is looking at the last 30 days, so kind of since the last time I visited with you all. Looking at departure from average, or how different from average temperature for the last 30 days have we been. And we see the central part of the state too, Pierre, Stanley County, Jones-Lyman County, much warmer than average, and the far west, northwest as well. So where previously early in the spring, we had dry conditions, no doubt about that, but the recent heat has exacerbated or made worse the drought conditions in a lot of areas, really increasing the water demand and water need from the landscape, from grasses, from crops, from soils, from everything. So really we're starting to see the heat take a toll. Looking at total precipitation for the last 30 days, just a snapshot here of some station data. I know there's some gaps in the map here of some areas where we don't have very many observers, but looking at, the oranges, reds are less than an inch and a half or less of precipitation. Typically in June, average precipitation is about an inch a week, depending where you're at, about 3/4 of an inch to about 1.25 inches, more or less in June. So to look at how much we're short over the last 30 days. This is the percent of average precipitation for the last 30 days. You see a lot of maroon colors, less than 25% of average. I would say a lot of them are less than that, very, very much so. You see a couple lighter red, a couple lighter orange colors here or there, but really it's been very dry, and the drought situation is changing week by week as we continue to miss out on any of the very significant rainfalls. We have seen, smaller events like we've seen over the last weekend. I know in the east especially, a couple tenths here or there. That's kind of helping us tread water. Especially on the crop, at least on the corn and soybean side. but I know other crops are already really struggling and or have been already at a significant loss, if not total loss. Those maps go up kind of through yesterday, as most weather observers report in the morning. So looking at today's reports from the last 24 hours, you know, some areas got rain just over the last day. This is looking at CocoRa's, our volunteer rainfall observer network. And if you haven't heard of CocoRa's before, these are folks that just have a clear plastic rain gauge in their backyard, something like the Kelloland gauge or the Ken Hirsch gauge, if you're familiar with that. 4-inch clear plastic with the inner funnel. And you report your rainfall each day on smartphone or computer. It's a great way to archive your precipitation, keep track of what's going on where you are in your backyard, ranch, farm. And two, through CocoRa's, through this network, you can also share drought impacts and what drought looks like out in your neck of the woods. So multiple benefits here of CocoRa's, and those drought impact reports go directly to a national database that's shared, for example, with the U.S. Drought Monitor authors and others. Your specific address is never shared. It gets down really just to your county if you share that information. So I encourage you to use that that condition monitoring report in CocoRa's if you have that option to let us know what's going on in your neck of the woods. That aside, just getting back to the last 24 hours, you know, we're seeing, you know, a couple tenths to maybe half an inch over last day on those blue dots, looking at the legend here. So not as much as we would really like to see. Again, I know there were some local thunderstorms that maybe aren't captured here on the map when I was watching the radar last night. There may be some locally higher amounts, but in general, not a lot of water from the sky last day. Soil moisture. This is one area where we've seen some very, I'd say, drastic change over the last month. This is the map using the South Dakota Mesonet, our weather station network with SDSU over the, this is as of yesterday, what the readings were. And if you've heard me present about this before, I apologize, I'll refresh again. This is what we call the poker chip map, where each circle, each disc represents a depth of a sensor. So from 2 inches all the way down to 40 inches deep at each of these locations where you see a stack. So the yellow colors now are indicating about a tenth inch of water per cubic inch of soil is a volumetric type of thing. So just looking at the scale below, just noting that the yellow oranges are drier. You know, when you get in the blues, they're a little bit wetter. So you see the northwest corner is actually one of the areas that had drought early in the season, but has improved actually in soil moisture, where you see more of the greens and blues. Despite some of the shallow areas, shallow soil layers being a little bit drier. But where we see really big differences are the central and eastern side of the state, where you see half to maybe a third of the soil moisture that we had a month ago. So the next slide I'm going to show you is what we had a month ago. So kind of look at your favorite area and see kind of comparison of where we were. So the next map will be a month ago in May. And you see a lot more greens and blues, especially in the central and east. We have lost some moisture in the northwest, but in general, it's holding on better than the rest of the state at the current time, as far as where our sensors are located anyway. So, you know, this is one of the indicators that we're looking at for the change in the drought situation over last month. So looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, I know there's a lot of eyes on this now this time of year. And this is what we're looking like at the national scale. The next slide I'll show is South Dakota specifically. So you see really the western, northwestern Corn Belt region, the Northern Plains region, in other words, is really continuing to struggle with drought recently in the last week here. Looking at South Dakota close up, there is a new area of D3, the red color down in the south central part of the state that was introduced last week. D2 severe drought encompasses pretty much all the central and east except for that kind of northeast corner where they were wetter earlier, say in the earlier spring, April, where they carried over a little bit of benefit there. But what I'm hearing from reports in the field and what I've seen traveling around the state the last week or so, that north central part of the state really is continuing to be very challenging with pretty slow crop growth and early, basically a premature ending to the wheat crop as well, and a lot of wheat being cut for hay, not just the north central, but a lot of other areas of the state across through the middle of the state. We continue to take a look at the Drought Monitor every week. So I am part of a group that kind of collects climate and water information and what we're seeing from impacts through the COCORAs and through other folks. And we visit with the Drought Monitor authors every week to try to make the best map, most accurate map that we can each week. I mentioned a little bit of change in the Drought Monitor, and this is over the last 4 weeks. So remember, this is a weekly product issued every Thursday morning. So I did say, we've seen some improvements in the drought category in the northwestern part of the state. A lot of that is due to May precipitation, where despite it being below average, it was still close enough to average that it no longer met the thresholds, the criteria for D3. So there were some improvements made in that area, but you see the degradations occurring on the eastern part of the state. So as we've stepped week by week through May and June, the 2 wettest months of the year, there has been some increase in the drought categories out that way. I'm going to focus on a couple different crops here, and these are maps that the USDA issues. There's a link at the bottom, but if you do a search for USDA Ag in Drought, you'll come up with a big PDF that shares maps like this for all the major commodities, some livestock sectors as well, and so on. So you can get a snapshot of what areas drought is covering for which commodities. So just taking a couple examples here, spring wheat was one that I've been hearing and seeing a lot about lately, as the Northern Plains is the heart of spring wheat country, and drought is hitting it pretty hard. 89% of the spring wheat production area is in some level of drought. The dark green areas, again, are the major crop growing areas for spring wheat. Light green are the minor crop growing areas. So you see really that's right over the Dakotas. We look at each state in the spring wheat production area, and this goes to say South Dakota here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th bar graph. So if you look at South Dakota here, 99% at the top, 99% of our spring wheat growing areas in some level of drought. 19% is in D3, 56% in D2, and 24% in D1, and that's how you read that. So you see that not just is the spring wheat production area in drought, but how severe, and almost every state here has some very extreme level of drought. So you've probably seen that a lot of folks, starting to cut for hay. do some nitrate testing to see if they can feed that, as getting to the time to make those decisions, giving anticipated low yield for grain. Snapshot on corn. And the reason why I'm showing corn is because I'm concerned over the next couple of weeks as we get into pollination period in mid-July. And I'll talk about this in the outlook part too. Conditions are not looking great for good pollination. And so I'm kind of concerned on corn as far as how drought's going to affect that crop. So currently nationally, about 41% of the corn production area is in some level of drought. But you see that over the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, you know, a lot of us here in this Western Corn Belt area are in some level of drought, as you see on this map. Oh, and the red hatched areas are D1 or worse, moderate drought or worse on the Drought Monitor. So to dig in a little deeper into each state there, certainly South Dakota is one of the worst hits with 99% of our corn growing region in some level of drought. The majority of that, 73%, is in D2. But you also see Iowa, just about half of their corn growing regions also in D2. So, you know, I know that markets are reflecting weather a lot right now, where we're seeing drought on the western side of the Corn Belt. They've had extreme rainfall in the east. I know in Michigan and other areas has had some very heavy rain over the last week and some flooding. So there's a lot of weather going on both ends here of the region. But again, you can look at these maps each week as they update with the Drought Monitor maps. I know Jaelyn's on the call. I didn't share the map, but 54% of sheep is in drought as well, sheep growing area. So I just wanted to share that too. Another thing about corn, not just the level of drought, and this is looking at week by week following the Drought Monitor, what percent, this is specifically for corn, going back 1 year, week by week, what percent of the corn growing region is in what level of drought. And so these numbers are reflecting percent of area nationally. And the thing to note here, I'm looking more recently. So since late April, early, mid-May, really, we've seen a very large increase, about 17% point increase in the area of drought over corn. And so it's not just that we've got corn and drought, it's that area is increasing and increasing in severity. So I think that's something, when we're looking ahead towards this, again, this critical July time period, moisture, rainfall is going to be even more important to carry us through to hopefully get some yield out of it. So looking at the forecast part of it now, 7-day, this is total 7-day precipitation using one weather model, but I think it gives us a good kind of broad picture of kind of what pattern is setting up. And you see over South Dakota, white means 0. That's 0. The green, less than 1/4 of an inch for the next 7 days. So dry weather certainly prevailing over the Dakotas, over the northern plains, really here, over our continuing drought area. So it's pretty tough news with not too much optimism for moisture in the next week as we get through the July 4th holiday. After that, the first full week of July, this is the 5th through 11th, the outlook continues to indicate, warmer than average temperatures. That's on the left. Warmer than average temperatures more likely over much of the Northwest and North Central states. Pretty good probability here. When they're looking at 60% probability, that's pretty high confidence for warmer than average temperatures. Along with that, you see the beige colors on the right, also leaning towards probability of drier than average conditions at that same time. Not uncommon in the summer, we often see warmer, we often see heat and dry hand in hand. And so it's going to continue to be a challenge for the next 2 weeks, it appears, at least. And even as I was looking this morning at some of the information that's out 3 to 4 weeks from now, same kind of pattern, with the temperature above average in the northwest, north central, and drier than average kind of over this broad northwestern part of the country. So it's, I know, not the best news, but I think now is the time to start making some of those decisions. I know Jaelyn will talk next on nitrate testing, as I know it's getting to be time to cut if you're going to cut, and maybe change your plan a little bit. Looking at July, the outlook here from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center came out on June 17th, and this is what they were showing at that time. There will be an update to these maps on the 30th, on Wednesday of this week in the afternoon. But from what I've seen up through today, I don't see a lot of this changing. Maybe something in the far southwest states, they might change the shape of that a little bit. But as far as us in the north here, I would still expect warmer and drier to be their leaning here for July. As we see the first 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks at least of July kind of look that way. When we look at July through September, the next 3 full months out ahead of us, it's kind of the middle to end of our growing season. Again, odds leaning towards warmer than average over South Dakota. And they kind of restricted that drier area really more towards the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. But you know, I think there's still a lot of time here. Depending what July shows up like. Again, we really need something more like above average precipitation to really get us some significant or substantial improvements overall. But if we can get some timely rains, especially in August, soybeans, they respond well to rain in August. If we can hold in there and get some rain later in the season, could be some benefit. But as I said, I think the next crop I'm worried about is corn, and certainly I think wheat's gonna be cutting here pretty soon, if not already. All that told, looking out ahead for the end of the 3-month period ending September, the long-term drought outlook here does show, you know, continued drought conditions. That isn't too much of a surprise given the warm and kind of leaning towards dry. The yellow shaded area there in the southwest, south central indicates drought development likely, where I believe that area was maybe D0, not quite in drought on the Drought Monitor. So wouldn't be surprised to see some further drought development. Again, over this period of time, we can see ebbs and flows, ups and downs in severity week to week, but it does look like drought will linger with us for a while. So certainly I hope you all can start to make some choices, some decisions, and take action, given what your drought plan might be if you're on the livestock forage side, and the crop side, what you might be considering for late summer, if you have opportunity for some different marketing and other things of your crop as we look out ahead. So try to keep it brief today. I know it's kind of a lot of information really, but happy to take questions or emails after the meeting today if there aren't any right at the moment. So thanks for your time.
Jaelyn is our sheep field specialist, and she's going to be talking to us today about nitrate quick test for standing forages. So Jaelyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Connie. Yeah, so like Connie said, I am the sheep field specialist based out of Rapid City. And as Laura was alluding to, it is getting to be that time of year when we really need to start making our decisions as to if we're going to cut or what we're going to graze. And one of those major concerns, especially for our livestock, is that nitrate concentration in our forages. So luckily here at SDSU, we can help you out with that. I'll talk a little bit today about nitrate toxicity and what that means in our animals, and how it accumulates in the plant. And then, how we do the nitrate quick test, the kind of samples we can take from you and what those results mean. So when we're talking about nitrate toxicity, really what we're talking about is nitrite. And that's what tends to cause issues metabolically in our animals. Most commonly, we're really worried about abortion, especially, as we're getting into that time when we're breeding predominantly our cows, but our sheep too, as we get into late summer and fall. We'll also see reduced milk production, weight loss, muscle tremors, cyanosis. So a lot of what happens with this nitrite is that it's actually changing the blood hemoglobin. And so you're going to see a little bit more bluer or brownish color in a lot of those mucous membranes of our animals if they do have nitrate toxicity. And then, of course, worst case scenario is, of course, death. But what we have to remember is that nitrite is a naturally occurring step in the way that those rumen bacteria are converting nitrate into proteins. But when we introduce too much nitrate too fast, our rumen microbes can't keep up. And so most of that in that process, we'll get a buildup of nitrite when in terms of it being converted into ammonia and then amino acids and proteins. So when our forages or our water are too high in nitrate, that's when we start to see issues. And plants do the exact same process of turning that nitrogen into protein. But again, when we get too much too fast is when we see significant drastic changes in light, water, and temperature. And so just like on a drought year, we tend to see, for that reason, a higher nitrate level in our plants. We really focus on a few things as nitrate accumulators, one of those being small grains, your corn, Sudan grass, sorghum, and millet. On the grasses side, brome, orchard grass, and fescue, and then sweet clover and alfalfa for our legumes. There are a few weeds that tend to be nitrate accumulators also, so if you have those in some of your pastures or something, keep that in mind. But really what affects our nitrate accumulation is the stage of growth, whether or not that plant is under stress, so in a drought year, obviously, time of day, and its herbicide metabolism. And then finally, we have to keep in mind our field variability, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But we see quite a significant difference across fields in nitrate concentrations. So when we look at the natural growth of any plant, what we see is that the less mature that plant is, the more nitrate it tends to have. And so that's why, we typically cut when we're starting to see those plants head out. Your less mature plants, if you're gonna go back in and graze some regrowth, that's another issue when it comes to nitrate. And so just keep that in mind as you begin to think about cutting crops for hay and things like that. Like Laura said, some of us are thinking about cutting our spring wheat a little earlier. So definitely not a bad idea to bring it into us and get it nitrate tested. An interesting study found that some of our cereal species accumulate nitrate a little bit differently. So if you look at the graph here, your oats and barley tend to increase in nitrate level when they're in that anthesis stage rather than just in the heading stage, like a lot of our other crops. So that's kind of interesting. But just to know, our cautionary level here is 1,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, excuse me. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the test. But it's really important that we're taking representative samples from across our field. This study conducted in 92 took 48 samples across a field. And what's interesting is that even some of those samples that were close together had significantly different nitrate to nitrogen levels. And so kind of across the field, everything was above our threshold of 1,000 parts per million. But you can see in certain areas, even samples that were taken right next to each other were, 3,000 parts per million different. So we really recommend, if you're going to bring samples into us, that it be at least 10 representative samples from across your pasture. And so if you know that you have a field that has maybe slight topography differences or something like that, or soil differences, make sure you're bringing us a pretty representative sample. The big piece of that, I guess, is that it just increases our reliability and make sure that we're getting you the best results possible. They also need to be cut at ground level. As nitrate, those plants are taking nitrates up from the roots, and then it's being distributed up the plant. And so your highest concentration of nitrogen is going to be at the bottom of that plant. And so with our nitrate quick test, we're actually testing that lowest growth node. So it's important that those plants are either cut at ground level, or if you just want to pull them out of the ground and bring us roots and all, that's okay too. And so as you can see, this is a sample that was brought into us, and that lowest growth node is going to be that little knot that you can see circled just above the roots there. And so that's where we're going to be sampling on this forage for an example. The nitrate testing itself can be a quantitative analysis, and that's when we send it off to the lab and actually get those numbers back, the actual parts per million. But that is something we have to send to a lab and actually have tested. And so to save you maybe some time and money, we do offer the nitrate quick test in a majority of our regional centers and county offices, and then we've opened it up to some veterinarians across the state as well, which is pretty cool. So this nitrate quick test was actually developed in Montana in the 1960s. It does require formal training and a certification program. I'll talk a little bit about the safety concerns with the actual reagent that we use. But just so you know, when you're bringing those plants in and they're being tested, those people performing the test have been certified in nitrate testing. And so this test is qualitative. And so we recommend that you come in before you harvest those plants and get it just a baseline estimate of whether there is nitrate present or not. That's all that this nitrate quick test can tell you, but it can save you having to worry about sending that sample into the lab. So the scientific name, I guess, for this is the diphenylamine blue test. As I mentioned, it is qualitative, so we won't be able to give you actual parts per million, but it can give you an idea of where your forage stands. There's two parts to our reagent. The first is this diphenylamine, and then the second part is the sulfuric acid, which actually is what interacts with the nitrogen in the plant. However, we know that sulfuric acid is not necessarily a safe reagent. It's very caustic and it's highly oxidative. And so, there have been stories of dripping the reagent on your pants or something, and it'll actually burn through or, damage surfaces if it gets dripped on a certain surface. On top of that, the diphenylamine is a carcinogen. So for producers bringing stuff into us, we just ask that, you be really careful as well. A lot of this I've alluded to, but again, it is administered in a lot of our offices by certified trained individuals. And when everyone is recertified annually. So then once we get your sample and cut that lowest growth node off, the reagent is then dripped onto that lowest growth node. And what you're looking for here is that chemical reaction actually turning the reagent blue. And so you can start to see that in some of those first samples that have the reagent administered. But you, especially in that bottom one, you see the rapid development of that blue coloration. So then once we've tested, this sample we would have identified as hot and said, okay, we would recommend that you send this one into the lab. It is safely neutralized. So we just use baking soda and neutralize the acid. And then at that point, things are relatively safe. So when you see that rapid blue development, that's what we're going to call hot. And that we're either going to tell you to wait and retest it if you don't want to send it into the lab, because as we mentioned, as those plants mature, we do see a decline in the amount of nitrogen in them. But really going to recommend that we get those forages or whatever sampled before you feed them to any livestock or before you cut them for hay. Oftentimes we see kind of marginal results. A sample from one part of the field will come in hot. A sample from another part of the field will be kind of on that marginal or negative. And so possibly, just recommending delaying before cutting and then bringing it back in. And then of course, safe is if we see no blue color. I guess the nice thing about this test is it is very conservative. And so if there's any presence of nitrogen whatsoever, it's going to detect that. But this does sometimes allude to a false positive, if you will, to where, yes, there's nitrogen present, but it's not at dangerous levels. But luckily, we hardly ever see false negatives. So this test is going to tell you if there's nitrogen present, even if it's at a safe level. We do have a lab document that gives you a list of labs that can do both the feed and water testing, if you so choose to do that yourself. And we can make those recommendations here at our offices as well. So if we're looking at our actual nitrate levels, as I mentioned, if we look at the 1,000 parts per million or less, that's safe to feed to your livestock. When we get up into 1,000, really to 2,000, there are feeding options. 1,000 to 1,500 is going to be safe for your non-pregnant animals. But if you are going to feed it to pregnant animals, we recommend that it really only be 50% of the total ration. And of course, if you have that one animal that decides that it really likes whatever forage is high in nitrate, you have abortions possible or that nitrate poisoning possible. As we move closer to 2,000, it should be limited to 50% of the ration, regardless of if that animal's bred or not. And of course, you still run a risk of seeing those symptoms. Now, animals can actually adapt to a higher nitrate diet. And so sometimes we might recommend that, you put those animals, if you're grazing a forage, that you put those animals on there for a couple hours in the morning or something, and then pull them off for the rest of the day and put them either on a cut forage or another pasture that is low in nitrogen. And then you can start to work those animals onto something that's a little bit higher. That is an option, but of course that takes a little bit more time as well to move those animals regularly. But really, once we get above 2,000 parts per million, we recommend to limit that specific forage to 35 to 40% of the total ration, and do not feed it to pregnant animals, just to be safe. And then anything above 4,000 parts per million is considered toxic and should not be fed to any livestock. Here's just a list of our QuikTest locations. So, look on this list and see which one is the closest to you. What's really cool is that we did open it up to several veterinarians this year. And so you can see on the right side of the screen, some of those veterinarians in the area that are QuikTest certified. And so, I do recommend that if you are going to bring it to an extension office or the vets, call ahead just to make sure somebody's there to get it tested. Fresh samples are preferred. And so just making sure that somebody's there, and so that you're not having to worry about making a couple extra trips into town or something. And this also is published on the SDSU website for your reference later on as well. And so with that, if you have questions, you can reach out to myself, or Adele Hardy is the cow-calf specialist that has kind of headed up the nitrate quick test here for quite some time. She's just recently asked me to help her out. So if you have questions, feel free to email us or give either of us a call. We're both based out of the Extension Center here in Rapids. So, and with that, I'll take any questions.
I see that we have a question. As you say, the levels diminish with plant maturity. Does that happen rapidly as the plant matures? Are we talking weeks between bad levels and better levels?
So when we're talking increasing in plant maturity, it kind of depends by the plant. I could go back to like that cereal grains example. It definitely depends. Typically, we're going to recommend, if you want to test and then wait a few days, typically we'll recommend you wait, 4 days to a week to retest. So I guess general rule of thumb is that, in 4 days to a week, we can start to see diminishing results.
Well, not seeing anything in the Q&A or in the chat. Just want to thank you all for tuning into today's Drought Hour. If you have questions, please feel free to contact Laura or Jaelyn or even myself, and we can certainly help with that information the best we can. We wish you a safe 4th of July, and we will see you back in July for the next round of Drought Hour. So hopefully we get some moisture and the maps are incorrect.